It's also exhausting. This is the hostile takeover of diversity and the way it poisons everything that it touches. There is a reason that die is the first syllable. Let's get into it. Hello, my name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I am an author, an editor, a robot, and let's get into diversity and how it has recently been killing everything that it touches. American Dirt. Maybe you've heard of it. It is a novel that has recently kicked up so much storm in general on the Twitter writing community that everybody wants to cancel Jeanine Cummings. Everybody wants to cancel really white authors writing anything other than biography, autobiography. So American Dirt, who gets to sell your story? How can fiction best engender empathy underneath the firestorm of controversy surrounding Jeanine Cummings' American Dirt are questions vital to storytelling. So in case you didn't hear about this story, here we go. It was supposed to be the book launch of every author's dream. Jeanine Cummings had scored a rare publishing industry trifecta. She sold American Dirt for 7 figures. A Hollywood studio bought the film rights. Oprah Winfrey anointed it her book club pick. Yesterday, Miss Cummings, this was January 30th, 2020, Yesterday, Miss Cummings' publisher canceled her tour and issued a public apology amid the firestorms of accusations of cultural appropriation and stereotyping. It's a pattern familiar to writers of young adult science fiction and other genre fiction because science fiction died before the RWA went through its business, and young adult has been suffering greatly for a while. We're going to get into that. And in case you want to see some of the videos I've already done about the diversity industry in young adult, just click right up here somewhere, and it'll take you to one of the videos that I've already done. But it's a pattern familiar to writers of young adult fiction, science fiction, and other genre fiction. But American Dirt, industry observers say, is the most high-profile work of literary fiction bound up in a thorny question: who gets to tell someone's story? Miss Cummings herself acknowledged the debate in her afterword of her thriller about a Mexican mother and son escaping a drug lord by fleeing the U.S. border. Quote, as a non-immigrant and non-Mexican, I had no business writing a book set mostly entirely in Mexico, set entirely among immigrants. She wrote, I wished someone slightly browner than me would write it. That's some rough wording. The furor over American Dirt centers around a previously non-controversial idea: authors using fiction to imagine lives other than their own. How novel. To some, the controversy represents identity politics run amok. To others, the dispute highlights a lack of diversity within the most prestigious echelons of the publishing industry. At the heart of the matter is a deeper question: how can fiction best engender empathy? So one of the things that I want to point out here is highlights the lack of diversity within the most prestigious echelons of the industry. I've met people that are like, well, this might be my identity, but it's not what I want to write about. But then you've got these specific kinds of people that are like, well, that's your identity, so that's what you should be writing about. Is it really that hard to just say, let people write what they want to write about, let people read what they want to read about by whomever wrote it, and be done? This feels like so much work when it's just let people do their thing. Quote, why it's happening now is because it is related to the politics of identity and the feeling that certain groups in society haven't had a sufficient voice and representation, says Ian Buruma, former editor of the New York Review of Books. But when it starts relating to fiction or drama or film, it seems to me a very doubtful discourse because, first of all, if every writer could only write about characters like themselves, that would become a very narrow exercise. And the whole point of writing, especially of fiction, is that you can get into the heads of people who are not like yourself. The caveat is that authors should strive for verisimilitude.
Verisimilitude.
There you go. Miss Cummings has claimed she was careful and deliberate in her research and traveled extensively on both sides of the border. Flatiron Books agreed to the Monitor's request for an email interview with Miss Cummings, but she hasn't responded to the submitted questions. Yet Latino authors such as Miriam Gerba, Danielle Pena, and David Bowles have rebuked Mrs. Cummings for employing non-idiomatic Spanish phrases, homogenizing Mexican regional cultures and geographies, and lazily relying on stereotypical tropes such as setting the first scene at a quinceañera. They fret that American Dirt will leave readers with the impression that Mexico is a hellhole. I mean, can we talk to the people that are like leaving Mexico to come here? Why aren't they coming here if Mexico is so great? Like, why don't the people coming from further South America stop in Mexico if it's so great? I'm not saying that it is hellhole, but I'm saying, can we have a conversation about why people are continuing through Mexico to the Southern American border if it's great? This other thing, like, this is acting like every other group in real life doesn't get. This is acting like Americans don't get stereotyped as fat and stupid, especially Americans from certain areas. Let's not pretend that Florida isn't known for, like, really retarded, crazy people, even though that's not. It's like old people that die and really stupid people that fight alligators. Isn't it Alabama that has incest jokes out the woo-woo? And California is hippies? Like, and just an entire country is assumed to be fat and lazy. Look at every rendition or thought of Americans, especially from Europeans' point of views and from Canadian point of views. Everybody gets stereotyped. Are you going to now go and fight all of those people on American presentations? Or you go, yeah, that's mostly right, because that's racist. Quote, Cummings identified the gringo appetite for Mexican pain and found a way to exploit it, wrote Miss Gerba, author of the memoir Mean, whose caustic review notes that Miss Cummings identified as white in the 2015 essay. In the run-up of the book's publication, the author described herself as part Latino because her mother is from Puerto Rico. Critics have compared Cummings to Steinbeck. I think a more apt comparison is to Vanilla Ice, Miss Gerba wrote. He is a national treasure. Thank you very much. By contrast, American writer Lionel Shriver, we need to talk about Kevin, has long defended the idea that authors should be free to try on other hats. At the 2017 Brisbane Writer Festival in Australia, she underscored that point by donning a sombrero at the end of her speech. Quote, we all observe each other, says Miss Shriver, and part of the self-examination is not always availing, is it? So sometimes others can see things about you that you can't. So I'm interested in the observations of people about groups to which they do not belong. If you're a good fiction writer and a good observer of the world, there are no limits to what you can take on with enough empathy and research, says Miss Shriver. You own the whole world for as long as you are there. It is your backyard. It is your experience, and there is no hands off. And that's for everyone, as well as artists. So you have the right to have an opinion about it, to experience it, to think about it, to talk about it. Of late, several genre fiction authors have been called out for misrepresenting marginalized groups that they aren't part of. The Civil War in the Romance Writers of America, which resulted in the resignation of multiple presidents, an entire board, and the cancellation of the 2020 convention, which, as far as I know, is back on, erupted in December after the RWA banned a Chinese-American writer, Courtney Milan, for forcefully objecting on Twitter to how Catherine Lynn Davis described Chinese characters in Somewhere Lies the Moon, which was published in 1999. In the world of young adult fantasy, Amelia Wen Zhao's Blood Heir, Kiera Drake's Continent, Laura Moriarty's American Heart, and Laurie Frost's The Black Witch were pilloried for alleged racist depictions of characters. The Black Witch was a fantasy that had like elves and creatures in it, by the way. I did a video on The Blood Heir where she basically got out in trouble for using slave trading and slaves in general because somebody said that it was appropriating black culture, but she was using the Chinese slave trade the whole time because apparently slavery is now black culture. I have an article pulled up for The American Heart, so we're going to get into that, and I've never heard of The Continent, so maybe take a look at that later. Polite critiques on Twitter and Goodreads were about as rare as a starred review for a James Patterson thriller in Publishers Weekly. Consequently, several of those books were pulled prior to publication and revised. Bestseller author Mr. Bowles, Feathered Serpent, Dark Heart of the Sky, Myth of Mexico, believes that those protest campaigns resulted in more empathy rewrites that were more mindful and dignity of the groups of people. I think it results in more resentment, to be honest with you. Quote, very few people are saying that people cannot write other people's stories, but what they are saying is that it's a height of privilege to believe that you are writing in a vacuum, says Mr. Bowles, who notes that relatively few books are subject to headline-making instances of blowback. All of this hand-wringing about, you're trying to censor me, feels more like a move by white hegemony, often an unconscious move, but a move nonetheless to continue to marginalize the voices of color. The limits of sensitivity readers. For its part, the publishing industry is very self-aware of its demographic makeup. Yesterday, Lee and Lowe's Books released a survey that revealed that 76% of the employees in the industry are white, 74% are women, 81% are straight, and 89% are non-disabled. In recent years, many publishing houses have striven to promote marginalized authors writing about marginalized characters with the hashtag own voice marketing campaigns. The industry regularly employs sensitivity readers to vet books. Sensitivity readers are dumb. More on this later. Particularly for children and young adults, for offensive material related to portrayals of race, nationality, gender, religion, sexuality, and ability. In her acknowledgments at the end of American Dirt, Ms. Cummings thanks more than a dozen Latinos who read the manuscript, including scholars and people at various nonprofit institutions in Mexico. Some are dubious that sensitivity readers can claim to fully represent a particular group. After all, people within different nationalities, races, classes, and genders aren't homogenous. True, everybody has a different experience with their background, with their country, with their families, and so anybody that goes, well, this is fake, this is a stereotype, this isn't real, now you're invalidating somebody else's experience. They're not trying to represent you. They're not trying to represent a group. They're trying to tell a specific story. Quote, they're being explicitly asked to make normative judgments, ethical judgments, aesthetic judgments, says philosopher and science fiction author Craig Delancey, Gods of Earth. Is the fact that this particular character is a criminal somehow now expressive of certain bigotries? Their evaluations go beyond fact-checking. They're subjective, says Mr. Delancey. It's always subjective. Even this is racist is subjective. The whole idea of racism and sexism is subjective. They're subjective thoughts. They're opinions. Case in point. Clark's World magazine recently polled the sci-fi short story, I Sexually Identify as an Attack Helicopter, not exactly a common category of intersectionality. When some readers interpreted it as transphobic allegory, the story had been vetted by sensitivity readers and it was written by a trans woman. There is no winning when you're playing in diversity, when you're playing to correct representation, when you're playing to show a specific background. There's no winning because somebody will always be more right and you will always be wrong. You can't do anything under these rules. It is a system of power to pull and threaten anything. That's why you can't play along. Mr. Buruma, for one, believes that authors shouldn't strive for sensitivity in ideological sense of placating readers. After all, many works of literature, including Lady Chatterley's Lover, Ulysses, and Last Exit to Brooklyn, have offended readers. Rather, authors should be sensitive to the behaviors of their characters who may well misbehave as a way to understand the human heart. Quote, fiction has an important role in making us understand not only ourselves better and how human behavior in general works, including our own, but where empathy comes in is that it allows us to get under the skin of people who are not like us, says Mr. Buruma, now a professor of human rights and journalism at Bard College in New York. By her own account, that's exactly what Miss Cummings set out to accomplish with American Dirt. She wrote that she wanted to remind readers that the people coming to our borders are not one faceless brown mass, but singular individuals. Some writers, including Anne Pratchett and Lauren Groff, testify to being deeply moved by the story. Quote, when I think of the migrants at the border, suffering and desperate, I think of Lydia and Luca, Miss Groff wrote in New York Times Review, in which she also expressed anxiety over the fact that American Dirt wasn't written by a Mexican or a migrant. You're reading a fictional novel, though. If you want to read a nonfiction story about a migrant from the perspective of someone like that, go to the nonfiction section and pick up a memoir. These standards are impossible. Also, how racist, how disgusting is it that you go, well, I enjoyed this book, I just wish that the author was a different color. Are you kidding me? Sandra Cisnero, the house on Mango Street, remains a staunch defender of the book and believes that it could reach audience who wouldn't pick up one of her books. It's going to be an audience who maybe is undecided about the issue at the border, Miss Cisnero told NPR's Maria Hanosa. It's going to be someone who wants to be entertained, and the story is going to enter like a Trojan horse and change minds, and that's going to change the minds that perhaps I can't change. But to Daniel Pena, bang, the plot amounts to lab-created brown trauma built for the white gaze and white book clubs to give a textural experience to people who need to feel something to avoid doing anything and from the safety of their chair. So we understand that children are not cookie-cutter learners, right? Some people learn better. We understand that some learn better visually, some learn better listening, some learn better hands-on. And so we try to tailor learning plans or understanding to a way that will make more sense to them. We understand people have different strengths and weaknesses. We understand that women can talk to women better about certain things, and men can talk to men better about certain things, and women can talk to men better about certain things, and men can talk to women better about certain things. You get the point. We understand that there's some crossover and there's some specific stuff. We understand, because we've had this conversation, that black people can reach other black people better about the family, about the hurt in the family, the destruction in the family, the past traumas within black families. We understand that. There's better cohesion in those kinds of traumatic discussions. So why doesn't it make sense to Daniel Pena here that perhaps if a migrant telling the story won't reach certain white people, that maybe a white person telling it in another way would reach a white person? Like, these are all just different methods of reaching somebody, of entertaining somebody, of talking to somebody, whether they go to American Dirt for entertainment or for education, whatever. How is it not understood that maybe different presentations might have a different effect? You have two people tell the exact same story in their own voices, and one is going to mean more to somebody than the other. That's just how it works. Yesterday, Flatiron publisher Bob Miller issued a public apology in which he wrote, quote, "We should never have claimed that it was a novel that defined the migrant experience." This is true. You really shouldn't have. That sounds like a marketing line. That just sounds like a marketing line, though, because it's very in your face. The publisher also canceled Miss Cummings' extensive book tour due to specific threats to booksellers and the author. Nobody should be threatening anybody about a book. Freaking step off and calm down. Go see your therapist and have a cigarette. Miss Winfrey now says that she wants to host a deeper conversation about American Dirt on her Apple Plus TV show, because she has to win back her crazy fans. Flatiron promises a series of town hall meetings at a later point in which Miss Cummings, quote, will be joined by some of the group who have raised objections to the book. Mr. Miller added, "We believe that this provides the opportunity to come together and unearth difficult truths to help us move forward as a community." I hope and pray that Miss Janine is not just going to be dogpiled on public television by a bunch of non-white people kind of whipping her for stepping out of her lane. This gets into the idea that diversity TM is a way to control people. It's a way to threaten people. So one, you must have, there are two steps to it that I can think of. There are two very important facets that I can think of. Number one is that you have to demand that X industry becomes more diverse. You must have more representation of whatever group. Number two is if you're not part of that group, you're not allowed to talk about it, write about it, and be involved with any of it. So that forces certain people out of the workplace so other people can come in only by virtue of being part of that group. And we wonder why so many people are now deciding on the progressive side that they are gender weird. Because as white women, they've progressed themselves out of a job. Unfortunately, literary fiction is not the only place that this has harmed. Let's take a look at what happened to Laura Moriarty's American Heart. It got in trouble for being a white savior story. By the time Kansas novelist Laura Moriarty's latest effort, American Heart, finally hit the bookstores this week, it had been almost a year since it started getting knocked all over the internet by people who had not read it. They couldn't have, since even the galleys weren't out yet. Still, the word was out that Moriarty had written a white savior narrative in which the main character is a 15-year-old white girl from Hannibal, Missouri. Yes, Mark Twain's hometown and the model for St. Petersburg, Missouri in his N-word-studded 1884 satire, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Moriarty's protagonist, Sarah Mary, does wind up accompanying an Iranian engineering professor named Sadaf as she flees to Canada to avoid being sent to the Nevada internment camp where all the Muslims are being held. But she's no one's savior, and that's not how the book's first reviewer, herself a Muslim, read it either. She gave it the highest possible rating and a star review in Kirkus. So they even had a Muslim read this book when there's a Muslim Iranian as the co-star, and it was still racist, even though the appropriate minority read it and liked it. Because there is no winning. These things are only about controlling and ripping down the author if they're the wrong color. But then, in response to the criticism from our voices, the article goes on, advocates for more diverse voices in literature, Kirkus asked the same reviewer to take another look and see if she was positive she liked it all that much. Oh my gosh, how painful. You go, I liked this. Well, can you read it again and make sure that's how you feel? Oh my gosh. So much for diverse voices. Are you sure? That's what you're looking for? I might know better than you. Might want to change your opinion. I might know better than you. On second thought, the reviewer decided that she didn't like it as much as she said she did, and the star was removed from the review. Oh my gosh, this woman. This reviewer was talked down to by assuming white people, saying, you sure you like that? I mean, do you really want to make those kinds of enemies? Because if you like this, you're going to have to explain it. And she said, nope. This just goes for women's agreeableness, generally. Score 1 for diversity? Hardly. Promoting new voices is important, but trying to do that by silencing other voices is becoming what you hate. When I met Moriarty in Wichita for coffee on the day her book came out, she said her publisher, HarperCollins, had almost pulled out of the project after Kirkus cowered. Even after she talked them out of giving in to the bullying, they invited in a team of sensitivity readers to comb the book for potential offenses to right thinking. Harper's didn't make me take every suggestion of the 60 or 70 they came back, but irony seemed to have eluded these readers, she said. I don't know what was in the book before this squad of correctness got a hold of it, but its main character is not a particularly bright or kind kid whose only real skill is lying. Until, that is, she learns about life, love, and Islam from motherly PhD holding Sadaf. In a few places, it's a little too educational, but a white savior narrative, it's not. It's Sadaf who's the Atticus Finch of American Heart. There are aspiring white saviors, too, among Moriarty's new left critics, very few of whom seem to be Muslims themselves. Given all the very real threats against American Muslims, it's hard to see Moriarty as one. And if writers are supposed to create only characters who are exactly like themselves, it's not art, but autobiography. Has she also had criticism from the right in Red Kansas? A little, she says, including a package left on her door warning her against misrepresenting the true nature of Islam. But in liberal Lawrence, where she teaches at KU, the charges of racism has made her recent months noticeably chillier. Most of my colleagues have been great, but not all of them. There's to be no book tour, and few bookstores around here have invited her to read from American Heart either. Quote, I'm not reading at Rainy Day in Kansas City, and they've had me for every other book. One of the few who has dared to stick by her, Sarah Bagby, who owns Wichka's Watermark Books, said that she's been advised to hire security for Moriarty's reading there. She didn't, and it was hardly necessary. The place was packed and everybody was smiling, well, except maybe. Because after Bagby introduced her guests as the Bard of Kansas, she asked the crowd not to ask Moriarty anything about the controversy. She was only trying to protect the writer she loves, but wound up answering silencing with more silencing. Moriarty tried to walk the admission back. Ask me anything, she told the crowd, and one guy took her up on it. There are some detractors, he called from the back. Do you care to give an apology? She didn't. I'm happy with it, and nobody has to read it. If they did, however, read only one sentence, I'd suggest the tagline on the cover. Fear is the quickest path to obedience. Then that's really the apex of what's going on here. Last year, Blood Heir was set to come out. It is, I mentioned it earlier in this video, it is written by a Chinese immigrant in America. I'm pretty sure she came to America. And it uses Anastasia as a starting point. It's a retelling of Anastasia, a Russian story. And it plays with the slave trade, the Chinese slave trade. Because she's Chinese and that background matters to her. And they called her for cultural appropriating the slave trade. Not for culturally appropriating the Russians, no, that's fine. But for the slave trade, because that belongs to black people. And so her publisher actually didn't pull the book, but she decided to pull the book and rewrite parts of it because of all of the controversy she was getting. With the Black Witch, the main character, as far as I'm aware, the Black Witch is like a bad person, not surrounded with the greatest people, kind of has a snooty attitude, and through her story, she kind of learns and grows as a person to be less of a bigot, basically. But people called it racist. Because she was a bigot. People called it, encouraging the behaviors because she wrote a character who's like that, because she wrote an imperfect character, because there were lines in there that were just disagreeable to some people. That's real life, honey. But apparently, people have more of a problem with saying something disagreeable about a certain race of people or a gender of people than they do with a person who kills people for their own business. So I was watching a Tim Pool video the other day, and he was talking about how Sargon of Akkad just won an actual legal battle in court against this woman who was trying to basically get him canceled, get him censored, get all of the money, take all of his sources of income taken away from him. She went onto Twitter and bragged about how she was going to do this. All of her fans and followers were like, slay queen, slay, you're going to win this. And then when it actually got to the court of law, she lost. And that is typically how all of this goes. These battles don't win in court, and that's why the aggressors in these situations do everything they can to avoid these things going to court. Consider the Courtney Milan stuff in the RWA. So Susan Tisdale and Catherine Lynn Davis submitted formal complaints within the company or within the organization that they assumed would be confidential. They should have been confidential. However, somebody who is friends with Courtney Milan was on the committee to receive them and released them. Now, so instead of these things staying quiet and within the organization for the organization to decide, Courtney Milan was able to take this into her court, which is Twitter, and rile up her fan base to make a stink. This is a power move. This is forming a mob. Because before anything has gotten out, before any decisions, before anybody knows anything that's going on, you take this private information, slap it in public, and start using buzzwords to radicalize a group. Outside of court, outside of what's legal. It's no different than if you just get all of your friends together, start gossiping about somebody in your neighborhood being a rapist just because you don't like him, and then getting everybody to yell rapist, rapist, even though you're not pressing charges, you have no evidence, and your case would lose in court. Courtney Milan knows more than anybody in this situation that she doesn't have a case. And so there is a rush to get this to the public for the public to make a for the public, the mob, to make a determination. Because she's a lawyer, I have no doubt in my mind that if anything with the RWA went to court, Courtney Milan would lose, much like happened in the Sargon of Akkad case. And I will link that in the description below if you want to check out Tim's video on it. It's very interesting, and it's how all of this stuff always works in the YA industry, in science fiction, in romance, in literary fiction, in the knitting community, which we have over here, where the same thing is happening. It's a couple people morally posturing to mob somebody for not having the correct morals, for supporting the wrong person. It all is a mob because you cannot do anything legally to somebody for this stuff. So instead, they want to burn the witch at the stake. And in case you haven't heard about the knitting controversy that happened last year, let's take a quick look into it. Gavin Haynes, who is a journalist and former editor-at-large at Vice, wrote, "Lately, we've been witnessing more and more small world fall apart under the weight of their vast moral center of gravity. In the past year, the middle-class, middle-aged, overwhelmingly female knitters of Instagram have descended into internecine conflict over racism allegations." Sound familiar? Young adult fiction has exploded into ethical gazumping war over what is allowed to write who is allowed to write about that what color of a character. In Canada, the music business has become consumed by ethical etiquette that a juror who submitted the band Viet Cong for the nation's top music prize was compelled to write a lengthy apology over how culturally insensitive his action was. I've become fascinated by the link between what we see in examples like these and the dynamic we've seen play out through history. In 1967, Mao's Red Guards took to the streets determined to root out the four olds of traditional Chinese culture, killing hundreds of thousands in the process. By 1968, they had fallen apart as factions fought each other to represent the truest version of Maoism. In 1794, Raspeiro found himself at the same tumbril he had prescribed for so many other problematic persons. In both cases, a bidding war for morality turned into a proxy war for power. In my new BBC Radio 4 documentary, I wanted to join the psychological dots between history's pinnacle nightmares and what happens at the end of your road. I decided to call both the phenomenon and the documentary the purity spiral. A purity spiral occurs when a community becomes fixated on implementing a single value that has no upper limit and no single agreed interpretation. The result is a moral feeding frenzy. And if you're interested in this, it is on a podcast, and I will also link it in the description below so you can check it out. Very interesting stuff. But while a purity spiral often concerns morality, it is not about morality. It's about purity, a very different concept. Morality doesn't need to exist with reference to anything other than itself. Purity, on the other hand, is an inherent relative value. The game is always one of purer than thou. It's not just another word for woke culture or even cancel culture or virtue signaling. Even though intersectional social justice is a pretty great breeding ground for purity spirals, it is one among many. Nor is it confined to the left. Neo-Nazi groups offer to some of the clearest examples of purity spirals, the ongoing parsing of ethnic purity into ever more Aryan subgroups. Perhaps the most classic one of all hails from Salem, Massachusetts. It is the social dynamic that plays out across the community, a process of moral outbidding unchecked, which corrodes the group from within, rewarding those who put themselves at the extremes and punishing nuance and divergence relentlessly. A purity spiral propagates itself through the tipping points of preference falsification, through self-censorship, and through loyalty tests that weed out its detractors long before they can band together. In that sense, once one takes hold, its momentum can be very difficult to halt. Our documentary analyzed just two latter-day purity spirals, Instagram knitting culture and young adult novels. Both seemed perfectly sized to be taken over. They were spaces big enough to have their own star system, yet small enough for the right of a dominant group to hold, and each a vast tapestry of what was effectively small businesses competed for attention online by fluidly mixing personal and professional brand. On social media, opinion, diary, and sales often exist within the same posts. Each individual's small business was uniquely vulnerable to being unpersoned, canceled. But simultaneously, each could benefit enormously from taking on the status of thought leader, from becoming a node that directed moral traffic. To take the example of Instagram knitting, the unraveling began with a man called Nathan Taylor. Gay, living with HIV, nice as pie, Taylor started a hashtag aimed at promoting diversity in knitting. Diversinity, to get people from different backgrounds to talk. And he did. The hashtag was a runaway hit, spawning over 17,000 posts. But over the following months, the conversation took on a more strident tone. The list of things considered problematic grew, the definitions of racism began to take on the terms mandated by intersectional social justice ideology. Knitters who wished to be on the right side of history began to post pictures of the books they were reading. Two came up over and over again: White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, or the Me and White Supremacy workbook by Layla Saad. The term racism had taken on its broad, all-encompassing systemic meaning. The idea that we live in a racist society and that this inbuilt, inescapable institutional racism is policed by 1,001 daily microaggressions. White fragility in particular implied that all dissent from the tenets was itself a sign of racism. Like Stalin's show trials or witch ducking, the loop had been closed. In game theory terms, objecting to something was now always a dominant strategy, and rejecting an allegation of racism was always a losing strategy. Inevitably, a ratchet effect took hold in which those with the most strident vision of what diversity meant were effectively handed the keys to the castle. That is, until someone with a more strident vision turned up behind them. By January 2019, this narrative of white supremacy and racial privilege had saturated the knitting world. What happened next was not something very important. In fact, it was the opposite. Something very trivial happened, a tiny spark that landed on bone-dry tinder. In January, a popular knitter from Nashville, Karen Templer, wrote a blog about her upcoming first trip to India, in which she suggested the experience would be like being offered a seat on a flight to Mars. Cue outrage at her racial insensitivity. Hundreds of comments later, Templer issued a lengthy apology. It turned out she loved Big Brother after all. Seeing what had happened to Templar in January last year, a Seattle wool dyer called Maria Tuskin decided that she would take the smallest of stands. In passing, she announced on her blog that she was taking a break from Instagram because of what she saw as online bullying in the knitting world. If she had any lingering doubt about whether or not the bullying was real, the tsunami of denunciation that ensued probably cleared that up. Clearly, the spiral had entered its final phase. It was no longer enough to just stay out of it. Only positive affirmations of support, and only in the most correct tone and timbre, could save it now. Professor Timur Kuran is professor of economics and political science at Duke University and the father of preference falsification. His theory relates to things like the fall of the Soviet Union, where almost no one saw the end coming because they hadn't realized that the entire population was falsifying their experience to each other. He sees a clear parallel. Quote, people who are trying to prevent members of the society from speaking the truth will often punish minor criticisms, he told me, simply to send the message to the rest of society that no dissent will be tolerated and no attempt to form an opposing group, even one that differs only slightly from the status quo, will be tolerated. If you allow minor differences, you allow people to coordinate around minor differences, and that can encourage even greater opposition. If people get that sense, then the whole process can unveil. Finally, just as the guillotine had eventually become Robespierre, had eventually come for Robespierre, Nathan Taylor, who had founded the hashtag Diversinity movement, found himself at its sharp end. When Taylor tried to inject positivity back into Diversinity, the glitter of things you don't want to do to your organization, His moral authority burnt up inside minutes. A poem he'd written asking knitters to cool it with genuine solemn nitty, I beg you, stop the enmity, was in turn interpreted as a blatant act of white supremacy. So just saying, guys, can we be nice to each other? This guy's a white supremacist. Can we get some guards in here? When the mob finally came for him, he had a nervous breakdown. Yet even here, I think I read somewhere that he attempted suicide or had to be hospitalized for suicide, but don't quote me on that. Yet even here, he was accused of malingering, his suicidal hospitalization described online as a white centering event. Yeah. See, look. So you bully people, they say, hey, can we just be nice to each other? You bully that person, they almost commit suicide, and you go, oh, boo-hoo, wah, wah, wah. There's no winning. You're just the bad guy all the time. Once it has gathered momentum, the dynamic of the purity spiral are those of the leaderless cult. You hold a viewpoint that privileges an abstraction of the world over the messy reality. You have a sense of mission, which sets you apart from the world, and you derive social status from being holier than the next acolyte. So when someone comes calling from reality land with a list of questions, the mere fact of having their viewpoint interrogated represents an existential threat to the sacred viewpoint. They circle the bandwagon. They circle the wagons. If you'd like to read the rest of this article, I'll link it in the description below, but I do want to get to the bottom here, where Gavin says, the simplest solution is to notice early, to notice better, and to call it out as something that has nothing to do with morality and everything to do with purity, and to say why that's different. If you call its name, it flinches. After all, the best defense against witch finders is a population that doesn't believe in witches. Taking this back to the RWA, to the YA community, to the literary community at large, and to any other community that falls into this purity spiraling, especially the RWA right now because they're going through a major overhaul. If you see this, do not give in. Diversity is not a strength of any organization. It is a foothold in which these people will get in and root out those who question. It is a power scheme to push people to the top who will use this in the court of public opinions. And by public opinions, I mean Twitter opinions, to kick up a dirt storm. And for all of those who are using the reaction on Twitter to critique your actions within an organization, to critique your actions in real life, to critique your actions as a writer, I want to remind you of these Twitter stats. 30 million, or 20% of Twitter's daily users are American. If you're an American organization or something, and you're making decisions based off of what you see on Twitter, remember that outrage, only 20% of it is American. Maybe. Let's go further down. There is another very, very important statistic that you need to see. 80% of U.S. tweets from 80% of U.S. tweets come from 10% of the user base. So that outrage that you are responding to isn't even 20% of the population, of the base. It's like 2% of the American base that is freaking out. It's not going to affect you in real life. Twitter is not real life. But that's why these people, like Courtney Milan, like those that went after the man in the knitting community, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name right now, they always turn to Twitter because Twitter will react. Twitter is very emotional. And Twitter is where the mobs hang out and wait for the next thing to freak out. But it is not a representation of the United States. It's not a representation of any country. It is a minute population that is on the emotional edge. And it should never be used to make decisions. For anybody struggling with this right now, know that when these people attack, they're not the good guys. It's not telling you anything about yourself, and it's not telling you anything about what you should or should not be doing. They're purity testing, and there is never enough conformity until you don't have an opinion or you're gone. This is why the Democratic Party is shrinking, because people are bleeding out because they are not perfect enough. If you're paying attention at all to American politics. it can be really scary to be against these people because they come on really hard. They come on and threaten you. Remember the Moriarty and the American Dirt stories where there were threats that came out because they had books that somebody got offended by because of the non-white characters in them. Okay, add diversity. But also, if you don't do diversity the way I want you to, or you're white, we're going to threaten you because you wrote a non-white character. Great strategy there, bro. I know it's hard, and it's so scary to stand up to these people. But they aren't in control. The only control that they have is the control that you give them. And if enough people stop giving in, they will realize they have no power. They will have to stop. So I wanna know from you. Let me know in the comments down below. Have you ever been cultured? Have you ever been canceled? Do you have any experience with cancel culture? Do you have any experience where you were in the in group and then you went to the out group, like the sir that led Diversity? I would love to hear from you. And remember, all of the things that I mentioned in this will also be in the description down below for you to check out if you are interested in reading these articles and listening to the documentary on Purity Spirals. I would love to hear from you. If you enjoy this kind of content or would like more, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any suggestions for stories you'd like me to cover, please leave them in the comments. And let me know if you might be interested in reading my book. I'm trying to figure out what to do with it next. Anyway, until next time, talk to you later. Bye.